Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui in Beijing. Ahead of the G7 summit in Japan, the country's Prime Minister Shinzo Abe paid visits to several European countries and Russia between May the 1st and May the 7th. Meeting with the Russian President Vladimir Putin, the two leaders discussed the Northern Territories, or Kurils dispute, in which both countries claim the sovereignty over the group of islands. A few days before Abe's visit to Europe, Japan's Foreign Minister Fumio Kishida paid his first official visit to China and met with Chinese Premier Li Keqiang. How should we look at Japan's recent diplomatic activities? What changes could Abe's visit bring to relations between Japan and Europe? And what could we expect for the future of Sino-Japanese relations? To discuss these issues, I'm joined in the studio by Anna Tangen, author and columnist, and Guiyun Tao, associate professor from Peking University. Also, Professor Takasato Watanabe from Doshisha University in Japan will join us via satellite. Before getting started, let's look at this.
It's been a busy month for Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. He visited 5 EU countries earlier this month, aiming not only to boost Japanese-European ties, but also to lay the groundwork for substantial talks at the Group of 7 summit to be held in Japan later this month. After that, another rigorous schedule for Shinzo Abe was to meet Russian President Vladimir Putin in the Russian Black Sea resort of Sochi. But the two sides didn't sign any documents. Abe hailed a potential breakthrough in a decades-long territorial dispute with Russia over a set of islands known as the Kurils in Russia and as the Northern Territories in Japan, which has prevented them from ever signing a peace treaty to formally end World War II hostilities.
It depends if Japan will finally recognize Russia's formula, which sounds that no territorial issue could be solved without the frame of the peace treaty. So it means that the territorial issue should be discussed within the text of the peace treaty and then go on.
As America's ally, observers say Japan is trying to pull off a balancing act between Washington and Moscow, while the US continues to impose sanctions on Russia. The growing relationship between Japan and Russia poses interesting questions regarding the regional geopolitical balance. Almost at the same time, Japanese Foreign Minister Fumio Kishida was paying an official visit to China, the first by a Japanese foreign minister in 4.5 years. He held talks with his Chinese counterpart, Wang Yi, who said China hopes that Kishida's visit will play a positive role in improving Sino-Japanese ties. However, the Japanese foreign minister specifically raised the South China Sea issues during his following visit to Vietnam and other Southeast Asian nations, which has contributed to China's overall dissatisfaction with Japan. So the bilateral ties between China and Japan continue to be strained.
Now, gentlemen, why do you think Prime Minister Shinzo Abe has been so busy undertaking diplomacy around the world, particularly the recent visit to European countries? Is it because of the Shinzo Abenomics, which has backfired? Therefore, he wants very much to divert attention from domestic economic woes to the external front by, talking smart about the G7.
Well, and since Prime Minister Abe came to power in the late 2012, he has been always very much active in visiting abroad, and this has made a major contrast with his predecessors. And the major purpose is to expand Japan's, let's say, diplomacy horizon, so that he can demonstrate to both the international community and a domestic audience that Japan is playing a larger role in both international economic and political affairs. So I think that because Abe in this summer is going to face an election in the upper house in Japan, so everything he did in the recent weeks would be aimed at boosting his support in domestic politics. So basically, he's creating a, let's say, positive image of his cabinet. So those other people would say, well, see, the Prime Minister is managing his foreign relations in the proficient way.
Your emphasis analysis about domestic politics makes a lot of sense, but what do you think of the alleged charisma, leadership and vision of this guy, Shinzo Abe?
Well, I mean, personally, I'm not a big fan. I don't think.
I can understand.
No, I've been on record on the show saying many times that Abenomics was a myth. It was just throwing good money after bad, and that has come true. I mean, the third arrow never appeared. The ability to pay back this mountain of debt still remains undone, and they're just doubling down on the amount of money that's going there. So with the domestic failures, I think he is trying to push it. It's part and parcel of his desire to reanimate the Japanese war machine, in the sense that by pushing an aggressive foreign policy, he is by association saying that we are a world power and therefore we have to project as a world power. I don't think that this is the way to go. This is a guns and butter argument, and he's putting his money into guns when it should be butter.
What is Mr. Abe by hosting G7 in Hiroshima, then 4 years later Olympic Games in Tokyo? What kind of message do you think this guy can deliver to the rest of the world when bilateral relationship between China and Japan, the second and the third biggest economy in the world, declined so sharply ever since the alleged purchase of Diaoyu Islands, 5 years ago?
Well, and this is a tricky question because on the one hand, most economists, either in Japan or outside Japan, believes that it's of vital importance to repair the relations between China and Japan so that these two countries can build a win-win relationship to help their economic growth. But the fact on the ground is that the distrust between these two countries actually have deepened in recent years because of their political differences and their differences on maritime issues. So I think that addiction actually in Abe's foreign policy. On the one hand, he said that he's going to manage his relations with China so that the Japanese business can continue to benefit from Japan's economic relations with China. But on the other hand, the Japanese elites and other political and policy makers, when they go abroad, they sometimes spread the China threat theory. They mention the South China Sea issue and exaggerate the Chinese challenge in that area. And other times, they also would spread the Chinese economic collapse theory. And they say that there's the risking of the Chinese economy is rising, and everybody should be concerned about the Chinese, let's say, the doomed Chinese economic future. So basically, you see that many of these responses and the actions taken by Japan has been pretty much politicized and sometimes even emotional. And I see very little constructive ideas and initiatives on the part of Japan when looking at their policy toward China.
I wonder if Professor Watanabe from Deutsche University shares with you the sense of desperation from perspective of the Japanese media on being surpassed by China economically. Welcome to Dialogue, Professor Takasato Watanabe. Very nice to have you back on our program. What do you think of the immediate media response to Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's visit to major European countries, particularly his historic meeting with President Vladimir Putin?
This is very complicated. However, behind his activities, there are at least two things. The first one is that he pays attention, he seemed to be paying attention to the world issues. But actually, he is seeing only the domestic issues. Second one is that to have the good relations with, it gives the impression that he is not controlled by the United States. However, to have the close relations with Russia is good to get the weak relations between China and Russia. So those two things are complicatedly, you see, mingled. The first one is that, as our colleague has mentioned already, Abe is not seeing anything except the next election. And in the next election, main issue is the revision of the Constitution. However, supporting rate for Mr. Abe is getting down and down in this connection. Now you see more than 60% of the Japanese people are against Mr. Abe's idea of the revision of the Constitution. And also, the supporting rate of the public polls is getting down, especially among the young women with children, because they are afraid of being deployed of the jobs, and also they don't have the nursery schools for their children. Those things are playing very important. So he decided to invite Mr. Obama, President Obama, to Hiroshima to make the image of his government, administration, very, very peaceful directed.
But our observation about the upcoming visit by President Obama to Hiroshima serves your purpose of domestic politics in favor of Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. For example, do you think the Abe administration is playing on victimhood? The atomic bombing killed thousands of Japanese towards the end of the Second World War. Now, the issue of victimhood may somehow boost the approval rating for Prime Minister Shinzo Abe.
Yes, you are right in a sense. However, President Obama is disappearing very soon next year, and Mr. Shinzo Abe, he is very warlike politician, not seeing reality of the world. He has strong allies. He wants to make strong allies with the United States because his grandfather had good relations with the United States. And also, he wanted to shake hands with Mr. Putin because his father, Shintaro Abe, 1980 foreign minister of Japan, went to Russia, and Mr. Abe Shinzo went there together. So these two family relations is more playing the bigger roles in his policies.
Thank you very much. Dr. Gui, in fact, Japan has no territorial claims in the South China Sea, and yet the Japanese Foreign Minister Kishida talked to his counterparts in Vietnam and other member states of ASEAN about the issue of maritime disputes. But in his meeting with his Chinese counterpart, Foreign Minister Wang Yi, he tried, and he was also received by Premier Li Keqiang, and yet he had somehow betrayed the expectations from the Chinese side. That's why Foreign Minister Wang Yi said we want Japan to square its deeds with words and to balance its hawkish behavior with real actions. What do you think of, say, the Chinese expectations?
Well, I think behind all these Japanese, let's say, conflicting diplomatic measures is Japan's concern about its declining presence in the Asia-Pacific region as a result of the rise of China. So basically, we still see that the Japanese political elite cannot, let's say, squarely view the changing reality in this region, and they see that Japan should compete with China over such issues like South China Sea and other regional issues, so that Japan can rally some support in its competition to China. But actually, this is against what is going on the ground, because most countries, even including Japan, are they have China as their, let's say, largest trading partners, and also in terms of many other, let's say, economic and cultural exchanges. So basically, I believe that Japan is still mismanaging and misperceive its relations with China and its foreign policy in this region. So I think that without solving this problem, the distrust between China and Japan would not be solved.
I see it slightly differently. From this perspective, I agree with everything that you're saying about Japan's concern about being economically displaced. It was a big blow to their ego to shift from number 2, world's largest economy, to number 3, and to continue to have a downward-facing economy. But I really see this as a game of go. This is a situation where they're reacting to each step that China makes, all right, and they're moving to block. And this is simply, and it will continue. And I don't think it's a Jekyll and Hyde situation. We've seen this in the past, even with Russia, when they were trying to, in 2008, when they were trying to settle this issue. What did they do? They directed all of the school books in Japan to say that they had sovereignty over the Kuril Islands. I mean, this enraged Russia, all right, and it put everything on a standstill. So I think there's always this sense of let us block, let us be a little bit more clever than we need to be in this particular case. I don't know that there's an end game, and that's where I would agree with you. There does not appear to be a strategy that wins.
Thank you very much. You are watching Dialogue with Dr. Gui Yongtao from Peking University, Mr. Anna Tangen and Professor Takasato Watanabe. We are discussing Japanese administration's diplomacy, the latest round of Japanese diplomacy, particularly the icy bilateral relationship between China and Japan over the Diaoyu Islands. We're going to address more of such issues when we come back. Please stay with us. Let me get back to Professor Takasato Watanabe for his comments on whether breakthrough is most likely in your negotiation with Moscow on the future of Kurils, since Japan has been put on loggerheads with the two most important neighboring countries, South Korea and China, in recent years. What do you think of the prospects, the immediate prospects of the four northern islands, the legacy of the Cold War? No peace agreement has yet been signed between the two countries. Do you think there's going to be any impressive breakthrough?
Internationally agreed document says that after Japan and Russia agrees the peace treaty, two of the four islands might be returned. However, this is not stable understanding or clear-cut understanding of the two countries. Japan wants to have two more, all total four. Russia says four islands belong to Russia after the result of the World War II. If both do not compromise, nothing will happen. However, recently, Russia wants to have the investment from Japan side, and also Japan side doesn't have any idea to make the Japanese people's feeling stable with satisfaction against Russia. So, Mr. Abe and Mr. Putin need something more on the territorial issue. If they continue the talks between the two, there might be happening something important. However, I believe that for the time being, Mr. Putin, Mr. Abe, they want to keep their present relations. Not bad, not good, but still they have the rule of talking negotiations.
Dr. Gui, do you think there's always a third factor for both Russia and because when Putin was talking with Mr. Shinzo Abe, do you think he's going to keep China in his mind? And we also have yet another third factor, the United States, for whatever party involved in the game.
Yes, definitely. And you see, the Russian president has been recently isolated in the international community, mainly due to its deteriorating relationship with the Western world. And for years, Japan has been trying to mend its relations or even improve its relationship with Russia, but this has been hampered by the American opposition. So, but Japan also would like to expand its diplomatic horizon in this region, because Japan had always had some problems in its relations with its major neighbors, China and South Korea, and the North Korean issue has also deteriorated in the Japanese perspective. So in this context, I think both the Japanese and the Russian president find it somewhat beneficiary in terms of expand their diplomacy, so that they can demonstrate to the outside world that they are still playing a significant strategic role in this region. And also, I agree that Russia needs Japan's investment, of course.
Okay, I understand what you're saying, but let us look at the reality. 2 islands that Russia is offering represent 6% of the landmass. If Shinzo Abe agrees to a situation where he gives up the 94% of the land, I think it would be very, very difficult. I think this is a more, as Professor Watanabe has indicated, a feel-good exercise that cannot actually end in anything substantive. I think they can come to some sort of agreement. Now, this was all, Japan actually gave up its territorial rights in the Treaty of San Francisco in 1951. All right, and the framework that they're talking about today was a joint Russia-Japanese statement in 1956, which said, you get these 2 islands if we can get the other 2 islands, but there must be a peace treaty involved in that. So I don't think that this actually goes anywhere in the end, but I think it's one of those things, once again, where Japan is playing go, and they're moving to kind of break the deadlock that we've seen here. Things, as you mentioned, North Korea, South Korea, China are all areas which are not very happy with Japan right now. And they're starting to feel the reverse encirclement that they were trying to participate with the U.S. in terms of China.
So, yeah, your points are well understood. Basically, the return of the 4 northern islands is getting nowhere, since it's viewed more like a theater for domestic politics. Let's look at what's happened between South Korea and Japan since the 4th nuclear. Do you think the resumption of joint military maneuvers under the nose of China, particularly the negotiations between the United States and South Korea on deployment of a THAAD missile shield, is a counterweight against the Chinese influence here to show anger of President Pyo King-hui? And do you think in doing that, South Korea is getting quickly close to Tokyo? Because South Korea is keen on playing a third-party role in between Japan and China, geopolitically, so that its bargaining chips can be used very well. What do you think of this political wisdom?
Yeah, I mean, there's a certain amount of that, but I mean, the THAAD issue is a very big issue in China. And it's probably the main reason that there was not a pickup on the phone call. The announcement prior to this that they were anticipating this kind of move was really not good for the relationship. But I don't know that South Korea has a lot of leeway here. Once again, we get back to economics. The amount of trade that they have, China versus Japan, the future of trade and markets as you go forward, it's clearly on the balance of China.
All right. Professor Watanabe, why Japan is so intensely engaged in diplomacy with other claimants in the South China Sea? It seems Japan is keen realigning itself with potential geopolitical competitors in the South China Sea, so that China could feel that it's being restricted, its influence is being managed by the United States, Japan, and your friends who claim sovereignty over those reefs and the rocky islands in the South China Sea. Is that true?
For the United States, the tension between or among the Asian nations is very good for them. And for Japan, some tension between China, Japan, and South Korea and other Asian nations is good politically, because the military industries of Japan want to have more, tension to get more benefit. This is the reality in the Japanese economy. When Prime Minister Abe went to Europe this time, he wanted to have so-called fiscal stimulus policy. This means that something should be taken as a policy to get more demand for the ordinary people. To get that kind of things, some big industries must get more profit. Now you see some big industries of Japan were bought by Taiwanese company and also Chinese company. So these things are giving pressures upon the Japanese economy, especially Prime Minister Abe is thinking of that, suggested by his advisors.
The last question for you, Professor Watanabe, is Look, September will be a very good season for tourism in Hangzhou, Zhejiang province. Hangzhou is one of the most beautiful cities in this country, and G20 summit is will be held there. And do you think that a meeting on the sidelines between Mr. Abe and Mr. Xi Jinping will help improve the mood of Japanese in bringing about whatever improvement, or if not a thaw in the bilateral relationship? What would the Japanese expect to have through a possible handshake on the sidelines?
Yes, this is thing. As you may know, that former Prime Minister Yasuo Fukuda suggested to Mr. Abe's cabinet and other politicians that even present G7, China should be included. If it is difficult, the inclusion of China into the next G7 should be the item of discussion in the summit meetings. Those things clearly show that every people in Japan know that without China or a Chinese participation in those organizations, we don't have the eternal peaceful structure of the world. And I think, you see, everything of the Asian matters should be solved in the ASEAN countries plus three, I mean South Korea, China, and Japan.
Thank you very much. That's Professor Takasato Watanabe. Do you think China will be included in G7 one day in the near future, as Professor Watanabe said?
Well, actually, a few years ago, the discussion of China joining G7 has been quite high on the agenda, and China did observe the G7, several G7s. But recently, I think the key point here is still the Sino-US relationship, because with the US-China still engaged in quite some competition and structural differences, you find that it would be difficult for other countries to refresh their ideas about how to deal with China and how to address these issues.
Thank you very much. With that, we come to the end of this edition of Dialogue on China-Japan Relations. Until next time, goodbye.